Every week, the USA drops 15 million screwworm flies from planes onto Panama. These are not ordinary insects. They cripple and kill livestock. They can even infect humans.
What?
And in the USA, there are entire factories where these flies are bred.
What?
And most importantly, the governments of other countries are not at all opposed to having flies dropped on them. Or maybe they're afraid to speak up, or are unaware of all this. What's going on, and what's the point of it? Here's an unobtrusive reminder to hit the like button if you forget to do this, a sip of delicious coffee, and let's talk more about it. So this is the place. You can call it a farm or a factory. Some even call it a plant.
Looks like
But
an
the
old
point is
video.
that this is where they grow flies.
So we've been doing this for a
the
while.
first plant of its kind in history was built in the city of Mission, Texas, to produce up to 200 million flies every week. Since the flies we're talking
so
about,
this is where all the flies be coming from, bruh. Damn,
they
I hate
belong to
these
the
flies.
family Calliphoridae or blowflies. They prefer to eat living flesh. Yes, it's exactly as you picture. Which is why feeding insects on a factory scale was initially a horrific logistical headache. Horrific and disgusting. Originally, scientists from the U.S. Department of Agriculture fed fly larvae a mix of warm ground beef and blood, but beef was expensive. At various times, they replaced beef with cheaper meats like horse, whale,
Horse?
pork, or cow lung.
Horse? Oh my god. Oh, we actually have a horse meat butchering facility in fucking Portland. There's only one, but it's for religious purposes because I guess there's like some religions that believe in eating horses.
They even
so
used
got-
nutria meat,
they're able to
an
do
aggressive
it,
rodent
so
that was
weird.
taking over Louisiana at the time. By 1962, the flies at the Mission facility were consuming 108 U.S. tons of meat and 10,000 gallons of blood each week. Just imagine those amounts. But growing the flies was just the start. They also had to be transported to the testing site, and that was a problem. They smelled so bad that airlines simply refused to deal with such cargo until the workers started spraying the boxes of flies with cologne. The plant in Mission
Cologne.
shut down in 1981 when fly breeding moved to Mexico and then to Panama. Today, the factory producing dangerous flies in Panama is located on an old sugarcane plantation about 20
I
miles
want to know why we're fucking breeding flies.
east
That's
of
what
the
I wanna
country's
know.
capital. Unlike the original feeding scheme, the larvae are no longer given raw meat, but they still need to be provided with animal protein. Honestly, it would be better if it was meat. The current diet is a more economical mix of powdered blood, milk, and eggs reconstituted and then thickened with cellulose. When this is poured onto the larva, the food looks like sewage. However, the insects seem to be okay with that, though they probably have no idea that they're getting a hell of a lot of attention. 115 people work here to keep the facility running 24/7, producing 20 million flies a week. All these 20 million flies grow up in a concrete maze without windows. Each room in the factory has temperature and humidity optimized for a specific stage of the fly's development. For instance, the larvae hatch in a room heated to 102 degrees Fahrenheit, simulating the body temperature of an infected animal. After hatching, they're transported to cooler rooms where they're fed and become
I mean,
larvae.
I guess for
A
like
modified
pets and stuff like that, the larvae would be good to sell, or maybe like feeding.
industrial
animals.
pill counting machine spits out 15 ounces of larvae at a time onto aluminum trays, which are then stacked in piles of about 50 each. Yeah, real factory stuff. What'd you expect? Just 2 days later, and fully grown flies appear. They're moved to a cold room where the insects enter a dormant state. They seem dead, but actually they're just sleeping. Then the sluggish flies are
Fleas
placed
sleep?
in a metal
I mean,
box the
fleas-
size of a
flies
washing
sleep.
machine and loaded onto a plane. The journey continues. Now it's time to drop off the flies at the designated spot. A small turboprop plane loaded with 2 million flies, one of many that used to be a military one but now spread deadly insects. The planes are equipped with a constantly rotating dispersal machine that spits flies out of the plane's belly. And if you think this isn't very high-tech, well, the technician used to do this by hand. He dropped small cardboard boxes with flies from the plane, but sometimes the boxes wouldn't break upon impact and the flies would die inside. Overall, things are more advanced now. By the way, the plane flies low, not more than 1,500 feet high, so all the flies need is to wake up and fly. And they wake up from the warmth, then scatter in different directions, taking over the territory. Now that the flies have buzzed off, it's about time we got to know them up close. Cochleomyia hominivorax. These insects sport large red eyes and metallic blue-green bodies. They're your typical flesh flies, the kind you've surely come across, but it's the details that matter. After mating, the females lay eggs in open wounds of warm-blooded animals. And when the larvae hatch from the eggs, they devour the surrounding flesh. Once they're well fed, the larvae drop out of the wounds, pupate, and a new generation of flies appears. For a long time, these flies have been a real curse for all farmers. They somehow get into livestock bodies through any openings in the skin, the navels of newborn calves, scratches from barbed wire, even a tick bite. Flies can exploit even the tiniest unprotected areas. After leaving the animal, they leave it to die painfully. And each year in the southern U.S., these flies kill cattle worth millions of dollars. Their range stretched from Florida to California, and the flies infected all warm-blooded animals, not just large cattle, but also deer, squirrels, pets, and sometimes even humans. These flies aren't picky at all. The main thing is for the meat to be alive and warm, and then excruciating pain for the host and often death. There's a reason I'm talking about flies in the USA in the past tense. For thousands of years, flies and their voracious maggots were a terrible fact of life in America. There was no way to escape or get rid of them because how do you get rid of flies that are always around where there's food and it's warm enough? However, in the 1950s, American ranchers started seriously thinking about a world without flies. At their urging, the U.S. Department of Agriculture took action, and they succeeded. They first eradicated flies in the USA and then in Mexico and Central America, leaving only a narrow strip of land, the Isthmus of Panama. It's the narrowest part of Central America connecting the continents. The extermination kicked off in 1951 when a group of scientists from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the same guys the ranchers went to, started letting loose male flies on Sanibel Island near Florida's coast. Not just any males, but sterile ones. It's a key point, and you'll soon understand why. But then nothing happened. Scientists kept at it, so did the flies, until they released a fresh batch of males further out on Curacao Island. And then a miracle happened. Within a couple of months, the flies completely disappeared from the island. This sparked a quiet yet daring project to revamp the habitat for domestic livestock. Ultimately, it transformed the lives of many animals, cattle, deer, and people across the North American continent. With the backing of state and federal officials, the U.S. Department of Agriculture launched a campaign in 1957 to eradicate flesh-eating pests east of the Mississippi River. 2 years later, when they succeeded, ranch owners in Texas, Louisiana, New Mexico, Arizona, and California started calling for similar action. Eventually, in 1966, the U.S. officially declared victory over the dangerous fly, but the sterile insect barrier along the Mexico border proved ineffective and had to be moved further, again and again and again. In 1985, scientists suggested placing the barrier at the Isthmus of Panama, and this place was not chosen by chance. Today, the fly control program costs $15 million annually. It might seem like a lot, but it's said to save agriculture $796 million each year, making it one of the best entomological success stories ever. Overall, it's well-deserved. Hold on a second. How does this all tie together? Flies, airplanes, and barriers? Well, it's actually quite simple. Eliminating flies is one task that's generally not that difficult, but stopping a new invasion wave is a whole other task, and that's what the invisible barrier was created for. It's maintained by the efforts of people. Every week, planes drop 14.7 million sterilized male flies over the tropical forest, and in Panama, a factory operates around the clock to breed these dangerous insects. But that's just part of the job. Inspectors traverse thousands of square miles on motorcycles, boats, and horses in search of random fly larvae north of the barrier. The slightest mistake could undo decades of hard work. Just think about it. The transcontinental barrier against the flesh fly has been existing for 50 years, and it's all because everyone involved takes their job very seriously. But why is the barrier set up at the Isthmus of Panama? Well, the U.S. government's very decision to eliminate flesh flies far from its territory in Central America was ultimately about money. Dropping sterile flies over the narrow Isthmus of Panama costs way less than maintaining a barrier, even a virtual one, along the U.S.-Mexico border that, by the way, stretches for 2,000 miles. Now, a word or two about sterilization. Scientists came up with a plan to combat flesh flies by studying them in the lab. They found that female flies mate only once in their lifetime, so if a female gets a sterile male that will not let her produce offspring, that's it. That fly will never be able to reproduce again. You get it? It's a brilliant idea. If we release sterile male flesh flies into the environment, the fly population will quickly die out. In fact, that's exactly what people are doing now. Breeding flies in factories, sterilizing them, and then setting them free.
Crazy.
Sterilization took some serious effort, though. When the idea first popped up, not a single expert knew how to pull off something like that. By the way, it was Edward Nippling, an entomologist from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, who came up with the sterilization idea. He fought insect pests all the time on his family farm in Texas as a kid, so the story meant a lot to him. But when World War II started, the scientist and his team focused on more urgent problems. By the time Nippling got back to flesh flies, he already knew that high levels of radiation harm human tissues and cells. An idea came up to sterilize maggots of flesh flies in this manner. To do this, scientists started passing them through an X-ray machine, experimenting with various stages of development and levels of radiation. The larvae needed to be damaged enough to become sterile, but not so damaged that they wouldn't attract a mate in the wild. And the optimal formula was found. And perhaps you, like me, thought, couldn't we just exterminate all those flies once and for all? Scatter sterilized males everywhere? Wait a bit and voila? Unfortunately, no. It's just plain impossible because this fly inhabits all of South America. I mean, all of it. So we'd need a bunch of extra factories to grow sterile flies and then an insane number of planes, fuel, flight permits. We'd need a ton of people after all. Not to mention getting every country's governments on board, listening to ecologists and all that stuff. In short, it's not an option. And if you're worried that the flies might escape from the factory one day and unleash a fly apocalypse, that's also not possible. I mean, sure, they could escape, but nothing bad would happen because people can make sterile flies very quickly. So they'll just live a bit in the wild and then die without leaving offspring. Now, if the barrier suddenly goes away, that's already serious. Here's a simple example, the Florida Keys. This is a place where deer are everywhere, and folks are used to them. So when the deer began acting strangely in the summer of 2016, people noticed. The animals started swinging their heads around frantically as if trying to shake something off. Then wounds appeared on their heads, big, scary, gaping wounds exposing white bones. It looked like something was eating the deer alive. That something turned out to be the flesh fly. The good news? The outbreak was contained. To do this, sterilized flies were urgently released on the islands, and everything turned out fine. But the most interesting thing is that nobody actually knows how flies that can reproduce got to the Florida Keys in the first place. It's still a mystery.
Immigration? They got in the
What about other countries? There are generally two types of flesh flies, Old World screwworm flies and New World screwworm flies. The New World flies are the ones I'm talking about in this video. The Old World flies are found across most of tropical and subtropical Africa, in some Middle Eastern countries, India, Southeast Asia, and Papua New Guinea. And there, the flesh fly still remains a problem. Even South American countries like Uruguay have sometimes looked into the possibility of getting rid of the parasite because flesh flies only bring losses and suffering. But the problem is that getting rid of these insects can only be done by acting together, like with cockroaches. Look, here's a country, and it borders other countries. That's usually how it is. But if you get rid of the flesh fly only in one country, reinforcement will quickly fly in from the neighboring one. Even if you release several billion sterilized males there, a couple of regular flies from the neighboring country will be enough to nullify all efforts. So unfortunately, doing something like that in one country alone is just pointless. And for countries across the whole continent to unite against the flesh fly, that's very unlikely. The USA got lucky here, a convenient location to create a small barrier and maintain it. And, well, money. Money always gets the job done.
Yeah, money always does.
You made it to the end of the video. You owe me a like. See you later.
I always like the videos I watch. Those things help.